The November wind was a physical thing, a predator that gnawed at the rotten timbers of the farmhouse and screamed through the cracks in the window panes. It carried the scent of dead leaves and coming snow, a smell Jake Carter associated with endings. He sat at the rough-hewn kitchen table, the ghost of his own life, staring at the scarred geography of his hands. They were a map of a place he could never leave and could never return to. Kandahar. A half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey stood sentinel beside a disassembled Sig Sauer. He cleaned the weapon with a practiced, automatic grace, the motions of prayer to a god he no longer believed in. Each piece of steel, cold and unforgiving, was a tangible piece of the man he used to be. A Navy SEAL, a weapon himself. Now, he was just the wreckage left behind after the real weapon had been detonated. The farm was his inheritance, a graveyard of his family's failures that now served as the perfect tomb for his own. The fields lay fallow, choked with weeds. The barn sagged, its spine broken. Everything here was a reflection of the ruin inside him. He existed in a state of suspended decay, waiting for the wind to finally scour his bones clean. He rarely slept. When he did, the dreams came. Not dreams, but replays. The Afghan sun, a merciless hammer. The fine talcum powder dust that got into everything. Your lungs, your food, your soul. The easy laughter of his team, the only family he had ever truly known. Marcus, his face split by a grin, clapping him on the shoulder. Two halves of the same soul, brother. Then the pressure plate. The world vanished in a concussion of fire and soundless screaming. He remembered the sensation of flying, then the brutal impact. Waking up in Landstuhl, the air thick with the smell of bleach and terror. A doctor with tired eyes telling him he was the sole survivor. The words didn't register at first. They were just noise. It was the silence that followed that broke him. The silence where the laughter of his brothers used to be. They gave him a medal for his wounds and a medical discharge for his mind. They sent him home, a hero no one knew what to do with. He didn't know what to do with himself. The man who had walked into that Afghan valley had been vaporized. The thing that came back was just a collection of scars and memories, stitched together by survivor's guilt. He picked up the slide of the Sig, its familiar weight, a cold comfort. The thought was always there, a patient shadow in the corner of his mind. A simple solution, an end to the replays. But some stubborn, deeply buried instinct, the same one that had kept him alive in firefights, refused to let him pull the trigger. It was a refusal born not of hope, but of spite. He had survived. He would force himself to endure it. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed a loose shutter against the side of the house. The sound was like a distant sniper rifle, and he flinched, his hand tightening on the weapon. The adrenaline spike was immediate, a jolt of electricity through a dead circuit. He was on his feet, his body coiled, before his conscious mind had even processed the sound. The warrior was dormant, not dead. The storm was getting worse. He needed to secure that shutter before it was ripped clean off. He pulled on a worn jacket, the fabric thin against the biting cold, and stepped out onto the porch. The wind tore at him, trying to push him back into the shadows of the house. He leaned into it, his jaw set. He had faced worse than wind. As he rounded the corner of the house, another sound cut through the gale. It was thin, reedy, and full of a pain so profound it felt like a physical blow. A whimper. He froze, his head cocked, listening. It came again, swallowed almost immediately by the wind's howl. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a stray cat. It was the sound of a dog, a sound of pure misery. He had heard men make that sound on the battlefield. It was the sound of a spirit breaking. He moved without thinking, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. He left the relative sanctuary of his own derelict property and headed toward the fence line that separated his land from the overgrown mess next door. The place belonged to a man named Jed, a lowlife who Jake had seen only a handful of times, always with a sneer on his face and a stain on his shirt. The sound grew stronger as he approached a dilapidated shed behind Jed's trailer. The smell hit him then, a foul miasma of filth and infection. He moved with a stealth he hadn't used in years, his steps silent, his body a shadow against the darkening landscape. He peered around the corner of the shed, and his breath caught in his throat. There, chained to a steel post sunk into the mud, was a German shepherd, or what was left of one. The animal was skeletal, its ribs a washboard beneath a coat of matted, filthy fur. One of its eyes was swollen shut, a mess of dried blood and pus. Fresh wounds, raw and angry, crisscrossed its muzzle and legs. It was shivering, not just from the cold, but from a deep, systemic agony. But it was the dog's one good eye that stopped him cold. It was a clear, intelligent amber, and it was looking right at him. There was no fear in it, no aggression, just a vast, empty expanse of suffering. The dog didn't bark or growl, it just watched him, its gaze holding a terrible, familiar understanding. Jake felt a dizzying sense of recognition, as if he were staring into a shattered mirror. He saw his own reflection in that animal's haunted eye, a veteran of a war it had not chosen, left to rot in the mud, a fellow ghost. In that moment, something shifted inside him. A tectonic plate of grief and numbness that had been locked in place for years gave a violent shudder. The cold, dead thing in his chest flickered with a strange and terrible heat. It was rage, a pure, righteous anger he hadn't felt since the day he lost his team. The flimsy door of the trailer creaked open, and Jed stumbled out. He was a big man gone to seed, his belly straining the fabric of a greasy flannel shirt. He held a beer bottle in one hand, his eyes, small and mean, fixed on Jake. "The hell you doing on my property?" he slurred. Jake didn't answer. He didn't take his eyes off the dog. Jed followed his gaze and sneered. "Mind your own business. That worthless cur is gettin' what it deserves. Wouldn't fight." He took a step toward the dog and drew back his foot. He kicked the shepherd hard in its wounded ribs. The dog let out a choked cry, a sound that ripped through Jake like shrapnel. And the dormant warrior woke up. Jake moved. There was no conscious thought, no plan. Just years of training and a sudden, volcanic eruption of fury. He crossed the 10 feet between them in 2 silent strides. Jed was still turning, his face a mask of drunken confusion, when Jake's hand shot out and clamped around his throat. Jed was bigger, heavier. It didn't matter. Jake was faster, harder, and fueled by a purpose that Jed could not possibly comprehend. He slammed the man back against the wall of the shed. The wood splintered. The beer bottle shattered on the ground. Jed's eyes widened in shock and pain, his hands clawing uselessly at the steel visor around his neck. "You don't touch that dog again," Jake said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, gravelly sound, the grinding of stones in a deep, dark place. It was more terrifying than any yell. Jed tried to speak, but only a gurgle escaped. Jake didn't want to fight. He wanted to end this. He drove his knee into Jed's thigh, hitting the femoral nerve with surgical precision. The man's leg went dead. He sagged, his entire weight now supported by Jake's grip. Jake shifted his hold, spun him around, and slammed his face into the shed wall. Then, with a cold mechanical efficiency, he twisted Jed's arm up behind his back until the shoulder joint gave way with a wet, popping sound. Jed screamed, a high, thin sound that was quickly cut off as Jake applied pressure to his neck again. "I am going to take the dog," Jake stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You are going to let me. If you call the police, I will tell them what I found here. If you ever own another animal, I will find out, and I will come back." He leaned in close, his breath a cold fog by Jed's ear. "And you and I will have a much longer conversation. Do you understand me?" Jed, sobbing in pain and terror, managed a frantic nod. Jake released him. Jed crumpled to the ground, a whimpering heap of broken bravado. Jake didn't give him a second glance. He turned his back on the man, an act of supreme contempt, and walked toward the dog. He had bolt cutters in his truck. He retrieved them and returned, the heavy steel tool feeling light in his hands. The dog hadn't moved. It just watched him with that single, unwavering eye. It had seen the violence, the brutal efficiency, but it showed no fear, only a deep, weary stillness. Jake knelt in the mud. He didn't look at the dog's eyes. He looked at the heavy, rusted chain. "This is going to be loud," he said softly. He positioned the jaws of the cutters around a link. With a sharp grunt of effort, he squeezed. Snap. The chain fell away. The dog was free. It didn't bolt. It didn't run. It took one hesitant step, then another, as if it had forgotten what it felt like not to be tethered. It looked at Jake, then at the broken chain, then back at Jake. A low, questioning whine escaped its throat. Jake stayed low, making himself small. He held out a hand, palm up, calloused and scarred. He didn't move. He just waited. The wind howled around them, a chorus for this strange, silent negotiation. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, the shepherd limped forward. It sniffed his hand, its cold, wet nose brushing against his skin. Then, its rough tongue darted out and gave him a single tentative lick. Trust. A feeling Jake hadn't known in years resonated through him. He gently scooped the animal into his arms. It was shockingly light, a fragile frame of bones and will. The dog whimpered in pain but didn't struggle. It rested its head on his shoulder as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He carried the wounded warrior away from the battlefield, leaving the vanquished bully weeping in the mud. He didn't look back. The drive to town was a blur. Jake laid the dog on the passenger seat, wrapped in an old blanket from the back of his truck. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting gently on the dog's side, feeling the shallow, pained rise and fall of its breath. The nearest 24-hour veterinary clinic was 40 miles away, in a town he actively avoided. Tonight he had no choice. He pulled up to the brightly lit clinic just before midnight. A sign on the door read Eris Veterinary Services. He carried the dog inside. The waiting room was sterile and empty, smelling of disinfectant and quiet anxiety. A woman in blue scrubs appeared from a back room, her expression tired but professional. "We're closing up," she said, her eyes taking in Jake's disheveled appearance. The mud-caked boots, the haunted look in his eyes, the blood on his jacket that wasn't his. Her gaze flickered to the bundle in his arms. "What happened?" "He needs help," Jake said, his voice hoarse. "Please." The woman's professional demeanor softened at the raw plea in his voice and the state of the animal. She nodded. "I'm Dr. Anna Eris. Bring him back." He laid the dog on the cold steel examination table. Under the bright clinical lights, the full extent of the abuse was horrifyingly clear. Dr. Eris drew a sharp breath. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity, her hands gentle but firm. She cleaned the wounds, administered painkillers, and checked for broken bones. Jake stood in the corner, a silent, useless sentinel, feeling more helpless than he had under enemy fire. He's severely malnourished, dehydrated, multiple infected lacerations, some old, some new. Looks like blunt force trauma to the head and ribs, she murmured, more to herself than to him. He's a fighter, this one. As she worked, she noticed something odd. Despite the immense pain the dog must have been in, it remained unnaturally still, enduring her prodding and poking with a stoicism that was almost unnerving. It was the discipline of a soldier, not a stray. I need to check for a microchip, she said, pulling out a scanner. She ran it over the dog's back. It beeped. Good, he's chipped. Let's see who was letting this happen to him. She looked at the scanner screen and her brow furrowed. That's strange. What is it? Jake asked, his voice tight. This isn't a standard registration. It's a military ID, encrypted, Department of Defense. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp with new questions. Where did you say you found this dog? A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in Jake's stomach. Before he could answer, Dr. Eris made another discovery. While cleaning the filth from the dog's ear, her fingers found a small, faded tattoo on the inner flap. She wiped it clean. It was a symbol, a trident, the insignia of the Navy SEALs. Jake felt the floor drop out from under him. He stumbled forward, his gaze locked on the tattoo. It wasn't just any trident. It was the specific sigil of his old unit. SEAL Team 3, Task Unit Bruiser. The world tilted on its axis. It was impossible. A coincidence. It had to be. His mind reeling, grasped for a tether. He remembered the training, the commands drilled into him, and the MWDs that sometimes worked with them. The handlers always used German. A habit, a tradition. Without thinking, he leaned down close to the dog's good ear. He whispered a word, a command he hadn't spoken in years. A specific command Marcus had favored for his own dog, a partner lost in the same blast that took the team. Watch, Jake whispered. Guard. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. The dog, which had been lying limp and exhausted on the table, stiffened. Its head lifted. Its ears swiveled forward, alert and focused. Its one good eye scanned the room, its posture shifting from that of a victim to that of a protector. It was a transformation so complete it was chilling. It was the response of a highly trained military working dog. Dr. Eris stared, her mouth slightly agape. My God. Jake stared, his heart hammering against his ribs. A wild, impossible hope warred with a deep, sickening dread. Marcus's dog, Kaiser, had been declared killed in action along with the rest of them. They'd found his tracking collar in the wreckage, but they never found a body. Could it be, after all this time? That microchip, Dr. Eris said, her voice low and urgent. When I scanned it, it likely pinged a locator. A low-power signal, but if someone is looking for this dog, they might have just gotten a hit. She looked from the dog back to Jake. Given his condition, I don't think they're the good guys. You need to go, now. She was right. If this was who he thought it was, then this dog was more than just a lost MWD. He was a witness, a loose end. And the people who had him, who had tortured him, would not want him found. Jake nodded, his mind a sudden, cold landscape of tactical assessment. He scooped the dog off the table. The animal was now alert, its eye fixed on him, waiting for the next command. I owe you, he said to Dr. Eris. Just keep him safe, she replied, already gathering a bag of antibiotics and pain medication for him. My number's on the bag. Call me if you need anything at all. He carried the dog out into the parking lot. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, clean stillness. The world felt unnervingly quiet, too quiet. As he reached his truck, a set of headlights flared to life at the far end of the street, pinning him in their glare. A black SUV, the kind favored by government agencies and private contractors, its windows tinted to an opaque, menacing sheen. It had no license plates. It accelerated, its engine a low growl, and screeched to a halt, blocking the clinic's exit. A door opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in tactical gear, all clean lines and professional menace. He moved with the easy confidence of a predator. He was not a thug like Jed. This was something else entirely. This was a professional. Carter, the man said. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried across the empty lot like the crack of a whip. He knew Jake's name. We'll be taking back our property now. Hand over the asset, and we can all go home. Jake gently placed the dog in the passenger seat of his truck and closed the door. He turned to face them. His body positioned between the SUV and his vehicle. He could see two other figures inside the SUV. 3-to-1 odds. Not great, but not impossible. He's not property, Jake said, his voice a low rumble. The man Shaw sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. I was hoping you'd be reasonable. We have orders to recover the asset by any means necessary. He raised his hand, and the other two men exited the vehicle, armed with suppressed pistols. In that split second, the world slowed down. The quiet veterinarian's office behind him, the cold asphalt beneath his feet, the three men advancing on him. The dog, a silent witness in the truck. The past and present collided. The war had followed him home. Jake didn't wait for them to make the first move. He exploded into action. He lunged not at them, but to the side, toward the clinic's entrance. "Get inside! Lock the door," he yelled at Dr. Eris, who was standing frozen in the doorway. The suppressed pistols coughed. Rounds impacted the clinic wall where he had been standing a second before. He shoved Dr. Eris through the door and followed, slamming and bolting it behind him. The large plate glass window of the waiting room shattered as a volley of rounds punched through it. They were in a kill box. "Get to the back. Stay down," he commanded. His SEAL training, buried under layers of trauma and whiskey, roared back to life. His mind became a weapon, assessing angles, cover, threats, opportunities. The waiting room was a death trap. He dragged a heavy reception desk, tipping it on its side for cover. One of the mercs kicked in the weakened front door. Jake was ready. He had grabbed a heavy-duty steel fire extinguisher from the wall. As the first man entered, Jake brought it down in a vicious, two-handed arc. The impact on the man's helmeted head was a dull thud. The man crumpled. A second merc entered, firing blindly. Jake dropped behind the desk as rounds shredded the drywall above his head. He was unarmed, a fatal disadvantage. He scanned the room. Surgical tools on a tray, oxygen tanks, heavy X-ray equipment, improvised weapons. He needed to change the equation. He heard them talking outside, their voices calm, professional. Breach the back, flush him out. He had to move. He crawled from the waiting room into the main examination area. He heard the shattering of a back window. They were coming in. He took cover behind a steel gurney, his heart pounding a steady, familiar rhythm. This he knew, this he understood. The chaos of combat was a language he had never forgotten. A shadow moved in the hallway. Jake held his breath. The merc stepped into the room, sweeping his weapon. Jake kicked the base of the gurney, sending it rolling hard and fast into the man's legs, knocking him off balance. Jake surged forward, a scalpel he'd palmed from a tray in his hand. The fight was close, brutal, and silent. A flurry of blocks, strikes, and grapples. Jake was wounded, a burning slice across his arm, but he disarmed the man and ended the fight with a final, desperate move, 2 down. Shaw was still outside. Suddenly, a crash from the front of the clinic. Shaw had used the SUV to ram through the wall, creating a new entrance. He stood in the wreckage, silhouetted against the headlights, a carbine raised to his shoulder. Jake was exposed. There was no cover, no escape. Just as Shaw's finger tightened on the trigger, a black and tan blur launched itself from the cab of Jake's truck. Kaiser. The dog flew through the shattered window, a missile of pure fury. He hit Shaw with the force of a freight train, his jaws locking onto the man's weapon arm. The carbine clattered to the floor. Shaw roared in pain and surprise, trying to fight off the 70 pounds of trained, enraged shepherd attached to his arm. The dog was buying him time. Jake scrambled for the down merc's pistol. He chambered around and brought the weapon up. Shaw, finally shaking the dog loose, drew his sidearm. Both men fired at the same time. Jake felt a white-hot poker sear through his side. He stumbled back, his vision swimming, but his shot had been true. Shaw staggered, a look of disbelief on his face, before collapsing to the ground. Silence. The only sounds were Jake's ragged breathing and the low, menacing growl of Kaiser, who now stood guard over his body, his teeth bared at the shadows. Jake slid down the wall, pressing a hand to the bleeding wound in his side. Black spots danced in his vision. He was fading. Just as consciousness began to slip away, he heard a new sound. A sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat. The rhythmic, chopping whump 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 of approaching helicopters. Not one, but two. They were coming in fast and low. Black Hawks. Floodlights bathed the ruined clinic in brilliant artificial daylight. Ropes dropped, and figures in full tactical gear fast roped to the ground, securing the perimeter with chilling efficiency. A voice, amplified by a loudspeaker, cut through the night. A voice from his past. "Stand down. This is Commander Thorne, United States Navy. Stand down." A figure detached from the cordon and ran toward the clinic. It was Thorne, Jake's old CO, his face etched with worry. He knelt beside Jake, assessing the wound. "Hang in there, son. Medics are on the way." "Sir," Jake managed to rasp. "The dog." "I know," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know. We're getting him home. Both of you." Another man approached, older, wearing the uniform of a 4-star general. He had a face carved from granite and eyes that held a universe of sorrow. He looked at Jake, then at Kaiser, who had stopped growling and was now nudging Jake's hand with his head. It was General Miller, Marcus's father. Thorne began to explain. After the IED, Kaiser was found, barely alive. A corrupt supply officer on base faked the KIA report and sold him to an off-book contractor, Shaw's employer. They wanted him for his genetics. He was part of a special breeding program. Top-tier MWD. They've been using him, trying to replicate his abilities. His voice hardened. General Miller never gave up hope. He used every resource he had to keep searching. "The chip you activated tonight was our first solid lead in 2 years. General Miller knelt, his knees cracking. He reached out a hand not to Jake, but to the dog. "Kaiser," he said, his voice cracking. The dog whined and licked his hand. The general looked at Jake, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "My son, Marcus, he left a letter for me, to be opened only if he didn't make it back." He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn, sealed envelope. "He made me promise. If anything ever happened to him, he said only one man could handle Kaiser. He said you were two halves the same soul, you and that dog. He said Kaiser would only ever truly be home if he was with you. He handed the letter to Jake. Jake's blood smeared the envelope as he took it. He didn't need to open it. He knew what it would say. It would speak of brotherhood, of loyalty beyond death, of a bond forged in fire, a legacy entrusted to him. A medic was working on him now, but the physical pain was a distant echo. The real wound, the one he'd been carrying in his soul for years, was finally being addressed. He looked at Kaiser, who was watching him with that same intense, knowing gaze he'd first seen in the mud. He reached out and buried his hand in the dog's thick fur. The grief he had held back for so long, the dam of numbness and rage, finally broke. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He wasn't just mourning Marcus anymore. He was grieving for the years of lost loyalty, for the suffering this noble animal had endured, for the peace of his best friend he had almost failed to save. Kaiser leaned into his touch, letting out a low, contented sigh. In the midst of the chaos and the wreckage, a silent pact was sealed. A broken soldier and a broken dog, finding their way back together. 6 months later, the sun rose over a different world. It crested the Montana mountains and spilled golden light across a farm that was no longer a tomb but a sanctuary. The fences were mended. The barn stood straight and proud, its roof new and whole. The farmhouse had a fresh coat of paint, the color of new beginnings. Jake Carter sat on the porch steps, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. The scars on his body remained, a permanent record of his history. But the haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes was gone. They were clear, calm, and present. He watched the morning mist burn off the fields, a gentle smile on his lips. At his feet lay Kaiser. The dog was the picture of health, his coat thick and shining, his body strong and muscular. The scars on his muzzle had faded, and both of his amber eyes were bright and full of life. He rested his head on Jake's boot, a constant, comforting weight. A dusty pickup truck rumbled up the long gravel driveway. Dr. Anna Aris got out, carrying a bag of dog food and a box of donuts. She had become a regular visitor, her presence an easy and welcome part of their new routine. She sat on the step next to Jake, handing him the coffee she'd brought. "How's my favorite patient?" she asked, scratching Kaiser behind the ears. The dog's tail thumped a happy rhythm against the wooden porch. "He's good," Jake said. "We're good." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the day be born. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared history forged in a night of terror that had blossomed into a gentle friendship and perhaps the promise of something more. They were three survivors, building something new from the wreckage of their pasts. Kaiser suddenly lifted his head, a worn tennis ball in his mouth. He dropped it at Jake's feet and looked up at him, his eyes expectant. Jake laughed, a real unburdened sound that echoed in the morning air. He took the ball and stood up, his movements fluid and strong. He drew his arm back and threw it with all his might. The yellow ball sailed across the field, a tiny sun arcing against the blue sky. Kaiser exploded into a joyful sprint, a blur of black and tan, his powerful legs eating up the ground. He was no longer a ghost in the mud or a weapon in the dark. He was just a dog chasing a ball, in a place where he was safe and loved. Jake watched him, a profound sense of peace settling over him like a warm blanket. The ghosts of Kandahar were finally quiet. The whiskey bottles were gone. The Sig Sauer was locked away, cleaned but no longer a temptation. He had found his new mission. It wasn't about fighting or surviving. It was about living. He had been tasked with saving his friend's dog. But in the end, the truth was much simpler. The dog had saved him. Two halves of the same broken soul, made whole again, here, in the quiet light of a new dawn.